Through the morning mist she emerged like a phantom, her silhouette slicing the Wyoming dawn in silence. Clara Wade moved with a quiet fire, her faded cotton dress soaked from the walk, clinging damply to her hips and thighs, each step sending the wet fabric swaying and sticking in all the wrong places. The morning chill hadn't touched her. Her skin glistened with sweat, and a single bead slipped down her neck, catching the pale light like a diamond about to fall. Her brown hair, braided tight, swung with slow rhythm against her back, a rhythm that stirred the still air, and something deeper in any man watching. She paused at the wooden gate, her chest rising gently beneath the near-transparent fabric, her breath shallow but steady, her eyes swept across the empty plains and locked onto him. Elias Boone stood frozen by his wood pile, axe in hand, muscles tense, heart louder than the birds overhead. A rancher, carved from solitude, Elias hadn't spoken to a woman in 20 years, not since betrayal left his bed cold and his soul colder. His world was cattle, barbed wire, and silence. No room for the kind of trouble that walked like Clara Wade. "Morning, Mr. Boone," she called, voice low and warm, smooth as whiskey, thick as honey. "I'm Clara Wade. I've come to learn how to milk a cow." Simple words, but the curve of her lips, the shimmer on her skin, the way she stood. It all felt like heat sliding beneath the door of a locked cabin. Elias's fingers flexed around the axe handle, suddenly unsure. 20 years of silence screamed at him to walk away, but the scent of her, wild flowers, sweat, and something almost sinful wrapped around him like smoke. She wasn't just here for milk. She wasn't just asking for lessons. Her stare promised something deeper, a need, a danger, a secret, and beneath that sweat-slick dress, clinging like a second skin, she carried something that could burn a man down to ash. If this story is pulling you in, drop a like. Let us know where you're listening from in the comments and hit subscribe to find out what happens next. Because when Clara Wade crossed Elias Boone's gate, she wasn't just bringing a request. She was carrying a secret that could shatter his world. What was it? Clara Wade stood at Elias Boone's gate, her breath visible in the Wyoming dawn, waiting for an answer. Elias's heart pounded, a traitor to the silence he'd perfected over 2 decades. Her request to learn how to milk a cow felt like a pebble tossed into the still waters of his life, rippling out in ways he couldn't predict. 2 weeks, he said finally, his voice rough as the splintered fence posts around them. Sunrise lessons, you do what I say, leave when I'm done, no personal talk, no exceptions. Clara nodded, her eyes bright with gratitude, but there was something else in her gaze. Determination, yes, but also a shadow of something unspoken. It set Elias's nerves on edge like the scent of a storm before it breaks. The first morning she arrived as the sky blushed pink, her work dress patched but clean, her old gloves clutched in hands that trembled slightly. Elias led her to the barn, hyper-aware of her presence, the soft rustle of her skirt, the way her braids swayed as she matched his stride. Inside the air was thick with the warm scent of hay and cattle, but it was her nearness that made his skin prickle. He showed her how to approach Bessie, the gentlest of his holiness, keeping his voice low. Slow steps, no sudden moves. Cows feel your fear. Clara mimicked him, her movements cautious but earnest. When she crouched beside Bessie, her dress pulled tight across her shoulders, and Elias caught himself staring, his throat dry. He turned away, cursing the heat that stirred in his chest. Each day, Clara learned faster than he expected. By the 3rd morning, she could position the milking stool without guidance, her hands finding a rhythm with the udder. But her progress wasn't what unsettled him. It was the way she listened, her head tilted slightly, her lips parted as she absorbed his words. It was the way she laughed, soft and unguarded, when Bessie flicked her tail in protest. That sound, so foreign in his barn, cracked something inside him, a wall he'd built to keep out the pain of betrayal. 20 years ago, a woman's voice had been his undoing. He wouldn't let it happen again. Yet Clara wasn't like the ghosts of his past. She didn't pry or flirt. She worked hard, her patched dress growing damp with sweat as she carried buckets or shoveled hay. One morning, as she leaned over to clean and utter, a lock of hair slipped free, brushing her cheek. The curve of her neck, exposed and glistening, caught the sunlight filtering through the barn slats. Elias's hands froze on the pitchfork, his pulse hammering. He forced himself to look away, but the image lingered, a dangerous spark in the dry tinder of his solitude. On the 5th day she asked a question that cut too close. "Have you always worked this ranch alone, Mr. Boone?" Her voice was curious, innocent, but it dragged up memories of laughter in this very barn, of hands that once worked beside his, now long gone. "That's not your business," he snapped, his tone sharper than he meant. Clara flushed, her eyes dropping. "I'm sorry. You teach like you've done it before." The sincerity in her apology only deepened his unease. She wasn't trying to manipulate him, but that made her more dangerous. She was real, and real was what broke you. By the 7th day, Elias caught himself watching her more than teaching. The way she spoke softly to the cows, her voice soothing their restless tails. The way her fingers, now steadier, worked with a grace that belied her inexperience. He hated how her presence filled the barn, how it made the silence he'd once cherished feel hollow. When she stumbled carrying a heavy bucket, he caught her arm without thinking, his hand lingering a moment too long. Her skin was warm, her breath catching as their eyes met. For a heartbeat the barn seemed to shrink, the air thick with something unspoken. He dropped her arm like it burned, stepping back. "Watch your footing," he muttered. Turning to the stalls, that night, alone in his cabin, Elias couldn't shake the memory of her nearness. He'd built his life to avoid this connection, vulnerability, the pull of a woman who could unravel him. Clara wasn't just learning to milk cows. She was learning him, slipping past defenses he'd thought impenetrable, and yet he hadn't sent her away. Why? Was it her stubborn resolve, her refusal to beg or manipulate? Or was it the way her presence made him feel alive, a feeling he'd buried so deep he barely recognized it? As the first week ended, Elias realized Clara wasn't just a student. She was a test, one he wasn't sure he could pass. Her determination to master the work stirred something in him, a pride he hadn't felt in years, but with it came fear. Every lesson brought her closer, not just to the cows, but to the parts of himself he'd locked away. And in the quiet moments when her eyes met his, or her hand brushed the bucket he held, he wondered what secret she carried, because no woman walked 15 miles alone to learn from a hermit without a reason bigger than cows. What was she running from or toward? The Wyoming sun climbed higher, burning away the morning mist, but the air in Elias Boone's barn grew heavier with each passing day. Clara Wade had become a fixture in his world, her presence as undeniable as the rhythm of his own heartbeat. By the 10th morning she moved through the stalls with a quiet confidence, her hands coaxing milk from the cows with a steadiness that rivaled his own. Elias watched her from the barn's shadowed corner, his jaw tight. She was no longer the uncertain widow who'd appeared at his gate. She was something else now, capable, alive, and far too close for comfort. That morning, as Clara worked with Dolly, the most stubborn Holstein, she leaned low to adjust the bucket. Her dress, damp from the early heat, clung to her back, outlining the gentle curve of her spine. A single droplet of sweat traced a slow path from her temple down the slope of her cheek and disappeared into the collar of her dress. Elias's breath caught, his fingers tightening around the pitchfork. He should have looked away, should have buried the ache rising in his chest, but his eyes lingered, drawn to the way her movements were both deliberate and effortless. She was a woman who worked with purpose, yet every motion carried a grace that stirred something primal in him. Clara glanced up, catching his stare. Her lips parted slightly as if to speak, but no words came. Instead, a flush crept up her neck, her eyes holding his with an intensity that made the barn feel too small. "Am I doing this right, Mr. Boone?" she asked, her voice softer than usual, almost a whisper. The question was practical, but the way she said his name, low, deliberate, sent a jolt through him. He stepped closer, unable to stop himself, his boots scuffing against the straw-covered floor. "You're doing fine," he said, his voice rougher than he intended. "Just keep your hands steady." She nodded, but didn't break eye contact. The air between them thickened, charged with a tension that hadn't existed a week ago. Elias moved to her side, ostensibly to check her technique, but his body betrayed him, brushing closer than necessary. His arm grazed hers, the warmth of her skin sending a shock through his veins. Clara froze, her hands stilling on Dolly's udder, and for a moment neither moved. The barn was silent except for the soft breathing of the cows and the faint creak of the wooden beams overhead. Her scent, wild flowers and earth filled his senses, pulling him toward a line he'd sworn never to cross. "Like this," he said, reaching for her hands, his voice barely above a whisper. His fingers closed over hers, guiding them in the slow, rhythmic pull of milking. Her hands were warm, calloused, but soft, and the contact sent a current through him, awakening desires he'd buried for 20 years. Clara's breath hitched, her body shifting slightly, her shoulder brushing his chest. She tilted her head, her braid slipping to one side, exposing the curve of her neck. Elias's gaze dropped to the pulse beating there, rapid and alive, mirroring his own. The urge to lean closer, to let his lips graze that skin, was overwhelming. His hand tightened on hers, and she didn't pull away. Instead, her fingers curled slightly, pressing into his, a silent acknowledgment of the heat building between them. For a moment the world narrowed to just them, her breath, his heartbeat, the shared warmth of their hands. Elias leaned in, his lips hovering near her ear, close enough to feel the heat radiating from her. "Clara," he murmured, her name slipping out like a confession. She turned her head, her face inches from his, her eyes wide and searching. The space between them crackled, a spark waiting to ignite. His free hand twitched, aching to touch the curve of her jaw, to pull her closer until there was no space left. Her lips parted, and he could almost taste the sweetness of her breath. But then a low, guttural bellow erupted from Dolly. The Holstein's sudden ruckus shattering the silence. The cow shifted violently in her stall, her tail lashing as she let out another panicked roar. Hooves stomping the ground, Elias jerked back, his hand dropping Clara's as if it burned. Clara stumbled, her eyes wide with alarm as she steadied herself against the stall. The other cows joined in, their restless lowing filling the barn with a chorus of unease. Something was wrong. Cows didn't act like this without reason. Elias's instincts flared, his hand reaching for the rifle propped against the barn wall. "Stay here," he growled, his voice sharp with urgency. Clara nodded, but her hand gripped the pitchfork, her posture tense and ready. Elias stepped outside, the morning light harsh against his eyes. The corral looked calm, the cattle grazing in the distance, but the air felt charged like the moment. Before a lightning strike, he scanned the horizon, his grip tight on the rifle. Then he saw it, a faint plume of dust rising from the dirt path leading to his ranch, too deliberate to be wind, riders, at least 2, maybe 3, moving fast. Elias's blood ran cold. Drifters had been plaguing territory, men who burned ranches and took what they wanted. Had Clara brought this trouble with her? Or was it tied to the secret he'd sensed from the start, the one that flickered in her eyes when she thought he wasn't looking? He glanced back at the barn, where Clara stood in the doorway, the pitchfork clutched tightly, her face pale but defiant. "Who's coming, Clara?" he demanded, his voice low and hard. Her lips parted, but no answer came, only a flash of fear or guilt in her eyes. The dust cloud grew closer, and Elias knew whatever she was hiding had just caught up with them, and it wasn't here to talk. Elias Boone's boots dug into the dirt as he crouched behind the corral fence, rifle steady in his hands. The dust cloud resolved into 3 riders, their horses pounding the earth, hats pulled low to shield their faces. Clara stood in the barn's doorway, her knuckles white around the pitchfork, her eyes darting between Elias and the approaching threat. The cow's restless bellows still echoed, a warning that had saved them from crossing a line neither was ready for. But now a different kind of danger loomed, one that demanded action, not hesitation. Get inside. Elias hissed, his voice barely carrying over the wind. Clara shook her head, her jaw set. I'm not hiding. Her defiance sparked something in him. Admiration, frustration, and a flicker of fear he hadn't felt in years. He wanted to argue, to shove her into the safety of the barn, but there was no time. The riders were closing in, their silhouettes sharp against the rising sun. Elias's gut told him these weren't random drifters. Their pace was too deliberate, their formation too tight. They were hunting. The lead rider reined up 50 yards out, his horse snorting as he scanned the ranch. He was lean, his face weathered and scarred, a Colt revolver glinting at his hip. The other two flanked him, their hands resting on their own weapons. Boone. The leader called, his voice cutting through the morning like a blade. We know you got her. Hand over Clara Wade, and we leave peaceful. Elias's blood froze her. They were here for Clara. He shot her a glance, searching for answers, but her face was a mask of dread, her breath shallow. She knew. These men, who are they, Clara? He demanded, keeping his rifle trained on the leader. Her voice trembled, but she answered, They're from my husband's past, men he owed money to. I thought I'd lost them when I left Cheyenne. The admission hit Elias like a gut punch. Her husband's debts, that was the secret she'd carried, the weight behind her desperate need to make her ranch work. These weren't just creditors. They were predators, and Clara was their prey. Last chance, Boone. The leader shouted, his hand twitching toward his revolver. Elias didn't flinch. You're on my land. He called back, his voice steady despite the storm in his chest. Ride out or you don't ride at all. The leader smirked, signaling to his men. In an instant, the air exploded with gunfire. Elias dove behind the fence, wood splintering as bullets tore through. Clara dropped to the barn floor, scrambling for cover as a shot ricocheted off the doorframe. Elias returned fire, his rifle's crack echoing across the plains. One rider clutched his shoulder, cursing, but the other two pressed forward, their horses charging toward the corral. Elias's mind raced. He couldn't hold them off alone, not with Clara exposed. Get to the house, he yelled, firing another shot to keep the riders at bay. Clara hesitated, then sprinted toward the cabin, her dress catching on a nail as she ran. The fabric tore, revealing a flash of her thigh, and despite the chaos, Elias's heart lurched, a reminder of the moment they'd almost lost themselves in. He shook it off, focusing on the riders. The leader was circling now, trying to flank him while the wounded man hung back, reloading. The third rider aimed for the barn, likely thinking Clara was still inside. Elias bolted from the fence, running low to intercept. He tackled the third rider as he dismounted, the two crashing into the dirt in a tangle of fists and dust. The man was strong, his fist connecting with Elias's jaw. But Elias's years of hard labor gave him the edge. He pinned the man, slamming his head against the ground until he went limp. But the leader was closing in, his horse bearing down. Elias rolled, grabbing the fallen rider's pistol, and fired. The shot grazed the leader's arm enough to make him veer off, cursing. Clara's scream cut through the gunfire. Elias whipped around to see the wounded rider dragging her from the cabin, his arm locked around her waist. Her dress was torn further, the fabric gaping at her shoulder, but her eyes burned with fury as she drove her elbow into the man's ribs. He grunted, loosening his grip, and she broke free, stumbling toward Elias. "Run!" he shouted, firing at the leader to keep him back. Clara didn't run. Instead, she grabbed a shovel leaning against the cabin and swung it, catching the wounded rider in the chest. He crumpled, gasping. The leader reined up, his face twisted with rage. "This ain't over, Boone," he snarled, wheeling his horse around. "We'll be back for her." He and the remaining rider galloped off, leaving their fallen comrade in the dust. Elias lowered his rifle, his chest heaving, blood trickling from his split lip. Clara stood panting, the shovel still in her hands, her hair loose and wild. For a moment they just stared at each other, the weight of what had happened and what hadn't, hanging between them. "You didn't tell me," Elias said, his voice low, accusatory. Clara's eyes dropped, guilt etching her features. "I thought I could handle it. I didn't want to drag you into this," her words stung, but not as much as the realization that he was already in too deep. He'd fought for her, risked his life, and it wasn't just about protecting his land. It was about her. The fallen rider groaned, stirring in the dirt. Elias knelt beside him, checking for weapons. "He's alive," he said. "But they'll come back, and they won't come alone." Clara's face hardened, her hand tightening on the shovel. "Then I'll fight too. I'm not running any more." Elias met her gaze, seeing the fire that had drawn him to her from the start. But as the dust settled and the sun climbed higher, he knew this fight was far from over. Those men wanted Clara, and whatever debt she carried was worth killing for. The question was, how much was Elias willing to sacrifice to keep her safe? The dust settled over Elias Boone's ranch, the morning sun casting long shadows across the blood-streaked dirt. The fallen rider lay bound in the barn, his groans muffled by a gag, while Clara stood by the corral, her hands still trembling from the weight of the shovel she'd wielded. Elias wiped the blood from his split lip, his rifle propped against the fence, his eyes locked on Clara. The threat had retreated for now, but the leader's words echoed in his mind, "We'll be back for her." Clara's secret, her husband's debt, had brought death to his doorstep, yet the fire in her eyes told him she wouldn't run, and neither would he. Elias broke the silence first. "You can't stay here, Clara." "Not if they're coming back." His voice was steady, but inside fear and something deeper wared. He'd spent 20 years building walls to keep pain out, but Clara had slipped through her courage and her grief mirroring his own. She shook her head, her braid loose strands of hair framing her face like a halo in the sunlight. "I won't let them take what's mine. Not my land, not my life." Her words carried a weight that pierced him, reminding him of the man he'd been before betrayal hollowed him out. A man who fought for what mattered. He stepped closer, his hand brushing hers, not with the heat of that moment in the barn, but with a quiet promise. "Then we face them together," he said, the words a vow he hadn't known he could make. Clara's eyes met his gratitude, and something unspoken passing between them. She nodded, and in that moment they were no longer teacher and student, but two souls bound by shared scars and defiance. Elias knew the cost of opening his heart again. Betrayal had nearly destroyed him once, but Clara's fight had rekindled a purpose he thought was lost. He'd protect her, not just her land, but the hope she carried. As evening fell, they stood at the gate, the horizon glowing red like a wound. Clara's hand rested on the weathered wood, her silhouette strong against the fading light. Elias watched her, knowing this wasn't the end of their fight, but the beginning of something neither had dared to name. The gate, once a barrier to his solitude, now stood open, a path to a future where trust might heal what time had broken. If this tale of courage and redemption stirred your soul, drop a like, share where you're listening from, and subscribe for more stories where the heart battles the wild. Because Elias and Clara's fight isn't over, it's just begun.